Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Hello again, and welcome to my 70s TV childhood. If you haven't listened to us before, you're very welcome. And if you're a regular listener, thanks for coming back. If you've come to hear a pinpoint, academic dissection of the social history of being a child in Britain during the 1970s, then I think you might be in the wrong place. But if you're after some reminiscing about what it was like growing up in the 1970s and the part TV played in our childhoods, then listen on. I seem to have set off a minor debate after last week's episode, featuring the Wombles and Bernard Cribbins. It appears I am by far the only person in this country who thinks that Bernard should be Sir Bernard. So if anyone from the Prime Minister's office or the Palace is listening, there must be something you can do to give the Honours Committee a nudge on this. I'll say no more, let's just keep it between us. Oh, and a highlight for me, the great Mike Batts himself liked one of my Womble-related tweets. Fame at last. Let me know what you think of the show on our blog, www.my70stvchildhood.com. Tweet me at 70stvchildhood or email me, oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Television viewing habits can be curious. Today, there is no necessity for any viewer to watch the traditional terrestrial channels, as there are so many other options available, like Netflix, Amazon, and many others. The idea of choice is not, as it was in the 1970s, whether you watched BBC or ITV, but you can take your pick of anything, even binge-watching shows such as Say Yes to the Dress, with its endless stream of brides trying on outrageous dresses, or Border Patrol Australia, with its similarly endless streams of hapless foreigners desperately trying to con their way into Australia, normally without much success. The BBC and ITV programming of the 1970s could be quite subtle in how it targeted its audience. Indeed, there were apparently many people who refused to watch ITV after its launch, as the whole idea of commercial advertising was far too distasteful for them. And, in turn, there were, allegedly, people who refused to watch the BBC and claimed that this was a good excuse for not paying their television licence. Now, whether any of this was actually true doesn't really matter for our purposes. What it does reveal, though, is that the two broadcasters did have their own identity and did try and target different audiences. This was as true for children's television as it was for programmes aimed at adults. And this subject has been raised by one of our listeners. I'm delighted to welcome one of our listeners, James from Cambridge, who's joined us. Hello, James.
Hi, Oliver. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for joining us on my 70s TV childhood. Just to start with, whereabouts did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in the sort of suburbs of southeast London.
And what was it like growing up there?
Like everybody, I think it was a fairly normal upbringing, really. I went to a local primary school, which was only a walk away, had a bunch of friends, and did sort of normal things, I guess, that most kids in the 70s did. Had a bike, cycled around a lot, played a bit of football in the back garden. All the usual stuff, really.
And as you know, we're all about 1970s childhoods and the part that television played in that. What memories do you have of television at that time?
Yeah, I think it played a very big part. Funny enough, I was thinking about this, listening to one of your other podcasts, in that thinking, gosh, that sounds like we must have watched an awful lot of television. But then I was thinking in the sort of the weekends or school holidays, after playing sort of 5 hours of 3 and in with one of my mates, there wasn't a lot else to do. And so we ended up watching an awful lot of television. But even then, even having said that, it was pretty thin on the ground a little bit with 3 channels and not a huge amount on the weekends or in school holidays.
No, that's right. And I guess without that much being on, we tended to watch the same things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was, yeah. I mean, even when we went to school, you'd all watch the same programs and you all chatted about the same things. Or the school holidays, there was, I think you've talked about it before, there was short windows in the morning where there were some kids' programs on and then in the afternoon. So, yeah, I have pretty happy memories of those TV shows.
No, thanks for that. I mean, you contacted us and you mentioned it was something that I found very interesting, the different attitudes to children's programming. There appeared to exist in the 70s between the ITV and BBC, which I thought was a really interesting concept. And particularly, you mentioned a couple of examples, and I think sometimes it was determined how people saw you as to which of these you watched, whether you watched Tiswas or Swap Shop on a Saturday, or whether you watched Blue Peter or Magpie when they were on during the week. So, I'd like to explore those in a bit more detail if I can. And I suppose starting with Tiswas and Swap Shop. I mean, I have mentioned on some other episodes that Saturdays before some of these programmes came along were a bit dull on the television. But I guess these were programmes that were absolutely designed for children and made in this country, unlike a lot of the foreign things we had. I mean, for those who don't remember, can you give us a bit of an indication, just describe what both of those were like?
Yeah, and I think it is fascinating. Often you were a Tiswas or a Swap Shop kid, or I'm sure we all watched both. And the same with Blue Peter and Magpie. Yeah, I mean, so Swap Shop, or I think it was called Multicoloured Swap Shop, was actually what its official title was a show on a Saturday morning on BBC. It was very long, I think. It was several hours long. And originally it was fronted up by Noel Edmonds, who is, for those who don't know, a relatively famous disc jockey from Radio 1.
Who's remained out of prison, I think, as well.
Yes, one of the few. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. And he had sort of a gang. I think people quite well known: Keith Chegwin, John Craven, who's gone on to bigger and possibly better things, and Maggie Philbin as well was the original, I think, female presenter on that. Yeah, and it was just like a kids magazine show, really, where they had lots of different segments and they had different people come. I mean, I think they actually, in classic BBC fashion, ended up having some quite famous people on. I don't know whether, I can't honestly remember whether they had the Prime Minister on, but they did have some quite famous people came on. And then the big thing they did was they arranged for kids to swap stuff. So if you had a board game you didn't want, I can't really remember how they organised it, but you could swap that for a football with somebody. It sounds a bit odd.
It's the idea of the sort of barter economy, isn't it?
It's sort of barter eBay or something, but like 30 years old. It seems really, describing it now, it seems completely bonkers, but it seemed to work really, really well at the time.
It did. I was trying to remember. For years and years, I could remember the telephone number. And I'm sure some of our listeners will be 01 855 8585. Now, somebody will tell me whether I'm right on that or not.
Slightly wrong, because I did look it up actually, because I knew it was coming. It was 01 811 8055. Not that I ever called it.
Well, I think I called it once. The first day it was on, I called it and didn't get through. And thought, well, there's no point ringing then, is there? So not really understanding the scale that there were probably 500,000 children ringing in at the same time trying to get through. But so that was Swap Shop. Yeah, as you say, it sounded very BBC in its approach. What about Tiswas? Yeah,
so Tiswas was just completely the opposite, really. It was complete mayhem. You turn it on and again, I had to, it's like it's been a long time, so I had to remind myself a little bit about it. Apparently Tiswas, and I didn't know this actually, was an acronym for Today is Saturday, Watch and Smile. I mean, that's completely new to me.
I didn't know that.
Nor did I until I had to remind myself a little bit. But yeah, so that was fronted up by Chris Tarrant, who was obviously a very big name in British TV. And I think over a number of series, he was supported by a lady called Sally James, who was quite an attraction for many.
The lovely Sally James, yes, set many young hearts aflutter.
I know,
and probably a few fathers as well.
Well, I think that's probably true. And also, young Lenny Henry was on that, and a guy who was called Bob Carrolgees, and he had a puppet called Spit the Dog, who was rather irritating. But I think the difference was it appeared to have no script whatsoever, and it was just complete mayhem. And they sort of ran around throwing guns over each other. They had I think a character called the Phantom Flan Flinger, and it just used to run around with custard pies splatting each other. And I think the attraction for it, because for kids, was just anarchy, and they obviously were just having a great time.
Yeah, I just remember the cage. They used to have a cage in the middle of the studio, and things like officers would apply. These are adults who would apply to come into the cage and have pies thrown at them and be sprayed with water and have buckets of water thrown over them all Saturday morning. Which, I mean, as kids, you're thinking, this is great. You can throw a bucket of water over adults, and they don't mind. In fact, they seem to enjoy it. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it was. I think you had one side which was fairly worthy, quite fun, interesting, BBC, and the other complete chaos. So yeah.
So where did you stand then, James? Where did you on the Tiswas?
I would say probably I was a bit more swap shop, but had a furtive flick overs occasionally onto Tiswas. How about you?
Yeah, I think I sort of started with swap shop, and then as I got a bit older, I started to graduate more towards Tiswas. Probably as I was getting a bit bolder and a bit more daring myself. Because there was always this sense of, well, this was a slightly naughty sort of program, and they were doing all these things. But then after a while, it became more acceptable. But it's fascinating to say how you can be classified by those two programs. But I mean, they both ran for a long time, and Swap Shop, I think, had all kinds of follow-on programs like Saturday Superstore and others, where it was just the same thing but repackaged as a different program with regards to the 80s.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
I think that's right. But whereas I think the Tiswas crowd went off into more adult stuff, because I remember they did something called OTT in the evening.
That's right. Yeah,
which is basically Tiswas just with swearing, I think. And so as a teenager, you're like, "Oh, this is amazing."
So they took their audience from the 70s into the 80s and sort of went grew up with them. Yeah, no, it's happy memories. And then we mentioned Magpie and Blue Peter. I suppose I remember I obviously started off with Blue Peter, as most people did. But then Magpie appeared to be something very different. I mean, they seemed to be much more trendy.
Yeah.
I mean, they had Mick Robertson, who was a bit of a heartthrob with his long black curly hair.
That's right.
Whereas on the BBC, you had the safety of the regular presenters. I mean, I mentioned on a previous podcast that my generation, what I remember the most was sort of John Noakes, Peter Purvis, Valerie Singleton, and Lesley Judd. They were all it's going back again, very wholesome and educational.
Yeah.
Whereas Magpie appeared a bit racier.
Yeah, I think even when you start, I mean, if you look at the theme tune, I think Blue Peter is like a hornpipe or something, and a bit sort of old fashioned, really. Whereas Magpie was although it was quite a rock tune. And I again just reminding myself about it. I was just quickly scooting onto Wikipedia, and I didn't realise it was the Spencer Davis group who did it. It was quite funky. Yeah, it was really quite funky.
One for sorrow, two for joy, three for a girl, four for a boy.
With a bit of heavy guitar in there as well. Yeah, that sort of kicked it off. And you're right. I always sort of, I guess like you, for me, Blue Peter was the Peter Herbs, John Noakes, Lesley Judd sort of era was really what I really remember about it. And it was a bit worthy. They had some celebrities on, and they did the Blue Peter badges, which were all very nice. I have to say, I do have fond memories of John Noakes and Shep the dog, and and he was always doing some crazy things, or getting stuck up a pole, or falling, or something. Yeah, again, it was like a guilty pleasure turning over to Magpie, which was they always sort of a bit trendy clothes and the big hair, and it was a slightly different, more groovy world.
Yeah, because I remember they had, I don't know if he was on it all the time. They had Tommy Boyd came onto it as well.
I don't remember him.
He was instead of Mick Robertson had the dark curly hair, he had light curly hair, so blonde curly hair.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it was all a bit more wild, a bit more daring. And they also had I'm trying to remember the other presenters. So Susan Stranks was on it, I remember, and then the lovely Jenny Handley, who was former Bond girl, I think.
Yes,
again, I remember her.
Yeah, they're a little bit more sort of glamorous.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, James. Glamour. Not much glamour about Blue Peter.
No, steady, nice and steady. You're building your models or something, whereas they were all a bit rock and roll a little bit on Magpie.
So I wonder where that came from.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's maybe something to do with the difference between ITV and how that was made in those days. I seem to remember that, ITV was all separate. I think you mentioned on a different podcast. In those days, it wasn't one company, was it? It was all regional companies, and they all had to sort of and compete. So maybe it's something to do with that. And they were made in the provinces more, weren't they? So they were let loose a bit more, I suspect, than BBC in London. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's a good point. And I guess the BBC was always trying to do its public service broadcasting bit. So things like Blue Peter were always very educational. I have to say a lot of worthy things were done. And when I say worthy, I'm not trying to do it down, but the sort of the good for society type stuff. Whereas I think Magpie was more likely to have your rock music or your pop group. I mean, I'm just guessing now, but you're more likely to have the Bay City Rollers on Magpie than you were on Blue Peter. Yeah,
you'd sort of think so, wouldn't you? And they'd be wearing the more sort of the up to date outfits, and you don't really think of John Noakes in a pair of trendy jeans or a trendy shirt or something when he's up Scarfield Pike or something like that.
No, that's right. I mean, it's interesting because I think in a way, as sort of the decade progressed, BBC tended to go a little bit more in that ITV's direction, because from being sort of quite straight and education and so on, they then started doing a few more groundbreaking things. I was just thinking Grange Hill. Grange Hill, for example, when that came on, there were several of my friends at primary school who weren't allowed to watch Grange Hill.
Really?
Because their parents had heard it was so, you had children talking back to the teachers and people smoking behind the bike sheds and all this kind of stuff. And they said, no, you can't watch that.
Yeah.
Well, as it turned out, it was actually a very mild representation of what secondary school was like anyway.
Yes, certainly some of the ones around where I grew up. I think you're right. I wonder whether maybe because ITV was a challenger and BBC had already been around for ages, that they just, gave it a go and weren't, didn't mind pushing the boundaries. The one thing I always get confused about with Magpie was Tomorrow People. Do you remember that series?
Oh yes, I do.
I always mix up the presenters. Yeah, I always have a visual memory of the presenters, and I always sort of muddled them up because they all had sort of big hair and they were all like quite futuristic.
Yeah, and the men were tall and thin.
Yeah, a bit like what's his name, Mick Robertson. Or something.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah, I can see that you very easily get them mixed up. No, I thought Tomorrow People was great. I can't actually remember much about it other than the fact they had these belts which allowed them to teleport to different places.
That's right.
The rest of the plots have rather left me, but it used to be. You think, how cool would that be to be able to say, to go and jaunt, as they said, and go somewhere else?
I know.
No, thanks, James. That's really interesting thoughts there. And be interested to see what any of our other listeners think about the difference between the attitudes between BBC and ITV. And, I'd really like you to tell us, what camp were you in? Were you Tiswas or Swap Shop, or were you Blue Peter or Magpie? Because we can determine an awful lot about probably what you turned out as adults by where your favourites were. So thanks for those memories, and thanks for raising the subject. It's really good to have you with us on My 70s TV Childhood, and hope to speak to you again at some point.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Oliver.
Excellent. A big thank you to James for raising this subject and for joining us and sharing his memories. So that's an interesting idea. Can you determine how the adult will turn out based on their choice of Saturday morning viewing, or by which magazine-type show they watched during the week? What does it tell you about yourself or others if you preferred Chris Tarrant to Noel Edmonds? Or perhaps you favoured Maggie Philbin over the lovely Sally James? Oh, sorry, I'm letting my bias get in the way here. Let me know. John Noakes or Mick Robertson? Jenny Handley or Lesley Judd? Leave me a comment on our blog, www.my70stvchildhood.com, tweet at 70stvchildhood, or email me, oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. I'd love to hear from you. So that's it for now. Thanks again to James, and a special thanks to all of you for listening. I'll see you again soon on My 70s TV Childhood. If you've enjoyed listening, please think about supporting the show by visiting my Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Oliver Colling. For £2 a month, you can become a Tufty Club member, get a shout out on the podcast, and learn how to cross the road safely. And for £5 a month, you can be a Blue Peter Badge member, get a shout out, and join me for a future episode, as well as trying on a pair of Peter Purvis's loon pants. All memberships are flexible and can be cancelled at any time. Your support is really appreciated.